I can still feel the chill of that champagne flute in my hand, the way the crystal seemed to absorb all the cold suddenly gathering in my veins. We were at the annual Cortez Enterprises Gala, a spectacle of wealth and influence I'd helped him build over 15 years. The room glittered, a constellation of diamonds and designer gowns, but my husband's gaze was fixed on a single, ordinary star. Isabel, his new executive assistant. I told myself it was nothing, just a boss appreciating an employee's dedication. After all, 15 years of shared history, of building a multi-million-dollar company from a single shared dream, of raising two beautiful sons. Surely that couldn't be unraveled by a lingering look across a crowded room. I forced a laugh at a partner's joke, the sound brittle and foreign to my own ears. I made my way through the crowd, my emerald silk gown whispering accusations with every step. When I reached Antonio's side, slipping my arm through his, I felt it, a subtle but unmistakable tension in his bicep, a fractional pulling away. He introduced us. "Isabel, this is my wife, Marisla." Her smile was a perfectly calibrated weapon, warm enough to be polite, sharp enough to draw blood. "The legendary Marisla," she'd said, her eyes sweeping over me with an appraisal that felt less like admiration and more like an inventory. I told myself I was being a fool, a paranoid wife seeing threats in the shadows. But that's precisely how the most devastating betrayals begin, not with a declaration, but with a soft, insidious whisper in your soul that you desperately try to silence, a whisper that grows, day by day, into the roaring storm that will eventually wash your entire life out to sea. And that storm was already forming behind her back. The weeks that followed the gala were a masterclass in psychological erosion. The late nights at the office, once a point of pride for me as his ambitious partner, now curdled into something sinister. His explanations, once detailed and enthusiastic, became vague, dismissive brush-offs. "Working on the Henderson account, don't wait up." His phone, which had always been a shared device, a tool for our life, became his constant, secretive companion. It buzzed with a particular, urgent rhythm that made my stomach clench, and he'd angle the screen away from me, his thumb flying across it with a nervous energy he never displayed with me anymore. The sound of his key in the lock, which used to send a thrill of anticipation through me, now sparked a cold dread. He'd walk in smelling of another woman's perfume, something light and floral, a stark contrast to my own warm, spicy scent, and offer me a hollow kiss on the cheek. The man who used to seek my counsel on everything from marketing strategy to his father's health now looked at me as if I were a stranger whose opinion was irrelevant. My instincts screamed in a constant, deafening alarm. But denial is a powerful narcotic. I dosed myself with the potent memories of our past, of the young couple eating ramen on the floor of their first apartment, dreaming of an empire. I told myself this was just a phase, the stress of success, a midlife crisis. I was so busy meticulously preserving the beautiful, gilded cage of our marriage that I failed to notice. He had already picked the lock and was halfway out the door. The Children's Hope Foundation annual dinner was the pinnacle of our social calendar, an event where we showcased our perfect union for the city's elite. I wore a gown of deep crimson, a color he once claimed was his favorite, a symbol of passion and power. That night, it felt like a costume. I was performing the role of Marisla Cortez, beloved philanthropist and devoted wife, while my heart hammered a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. I was discussing a new endowment with the foundation's director when I saw them, reflected in the vast, ornate mirror that spanned the entire back wall of the ballroom. Antonio and Isabel. They were standing near the terrace doors, partially obscured by a potted fern, but the mirror offered a cruel, unobstructed view. His body was angled toward hers, creating an intimate bubble in the crowded room. His hand was on her waist, not in a professional, guiding way, but with a familiar, possessive curve of his fingers. She leaned in, whispering something that made him throw his head back with a laugh I hadn't heard from him in months, a genuine, unguarded sound of delight. His lips were dangerously close to her temple. The truth, which I had been diligently smothering for weeks, finally broke free. It was no longer a ghost in my peripheral vision. It was standing in high definition, dancing in a slinky black dress under the crystal chandeliers. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The delicate scallop on my fork suddenly looked as heavy as an anchor. I didn't move. I didn't scream. I just stood there, a statue in crimson silk, watching the live broadcast of my marriage's final, public execution, my world shattering into a million silent, glittering pieces. He chose cowardice over confrontation. A week after the dinner that shattered my reality, a week of suffocating silence and separate bedrooms, the doorbell rang. A young man in a uniform held out a thick manila envelope. "Marisla Cortez?" he asked. I knew what it was before I even took it. The paper was cold, the contents feeling like a lead weight in my hands. Inside were the divorce papers, filed under irreconcilable differences. The sterile legal language was a violent contrast to the messy, bloody reality of our ending. He came home that night, his face a carefully constructed mask of pained resignation. He didn't look at me as he poured a scotch. "Marisla," he began, his voice tired. "It's not you, it's me. I've lost myself. I need to find who I am without all of this." He gestured vaguely, encompassing the mansion, the life, me. I looked at this man, this stranger I had loved more than my own breath, and I felt a profound, hollowing calm. The storm of grief and rage I had expected was absent, replaced by the icy stillness of absolute clarity. The love had been systematically dismantled, piece by piece, and now only the empty architecture remained. I didn't ask about Isabel. I didn't remind him of our vows, our children, our history. There were no tears, no pleas, no bargaining. I simply walked to his mahogany desk, the one I had helped him pick out, picked up the heavy Montblanc pen he was so proud of, and signed my name on the line that severed our legal union. My hand did not shake, because in that moment, I realized the most valuable thing I could salvage from the wreckage was not money or property, but my own self-respect. I would walk away with my dignity intact, even if my heart was in ruins. The day I left the mansion on Willow Creek Drive was a quiet, internal funeral. A moving company I'd hired myself arrived. Their white truck a stark anomaly in our pristine, gated neighborhood. I moved through the cavernous rooms like a ghost, directing them to take only what was unequivocally mine. My books, my grandmother's china, the artwork I'd collected before I'd even met Antonio, the family photos. The house itself had become a museum dedicated to a civilization that had gone extinct. The grand foyer echoed with the ghost of our sons, laughter as they raced through it on Christmas morning. The formal dining table, which could seat 20, seemed to stretch into infinity, a vast plain of polished wood where so many conversations had died. The master suite, with its panoramic views of the city, was now just a room with a bed too large for one person. I stood in the walk-in closet, my side neatly packed away, his side still overflowing with custom-tailored suits and silk ties, a monument to the man who was no longer there. I left behind the diamond necklace he'd given me on our 10th anniversary, the one he'd fastened with such tenderness. I left the keys to the Mercedes on the kitchen island. These were not my treasures anymore. They were the artifacts of a life that had been a beautiful, intricate lie. As I pulled the heavy oak door shut for the final time, the solid thud it made was the most definitive sound I had ever heard. There was no dramatic, tearful farewell, no satisfying, fiery confrontation. There was only the immense, echoing silence of an ending, and the terrifying, wide-open silence of a future I now had to face completely and utterly alone. The first month in my modest downtown apartment felt like learning to breathe underwater. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was accusatory. I would wake up reaching for a body that was no longer there, the space beside me a cold monument to my failure. Depression came in relentless waves, pulling me under with memories of what was and the terrifying uncertainty of what would be. I spent days in my bathrobe, staring at the blank walls, the ghost of Isabel's triumphant smile haunting my every thought. But then, one rainy Tuesday, I caught my reflection in the dark screen of my television, a pale, hollow-eyed woman drowning in self-pity. Something in me snapped. This wasn't me. The woman who had helped Antonio build an empire from a single idea would not be defeated by a betrayal. The fire that had been smothered under years of playing the supportive wife began to rekindle. I marched into the bathroom, found a pair of sewing scissors, and in front of the mirror I methodically cut off the long, dark hair he had always loved. It fell to the floor in sad, limp clumps. Then I took the diamond rings, my engagement and wedding bands, to a jeweler and sold them for a fraction of their worth. The money felt clean mine. It wasn't a gift from him, it was a reclaiming. I wasn't rebuilding for revenge. I was rebuilding for resurrection. The phoenix doesn't rise to spite the ashes. It rises because it must. Social media became a curated gallery of my humiliation. I told myself I wouldn't look, but like picking at a scab, the compulsion was too strong. And there it was, just 3 months after our divorce was finalized. A flood of professionally shot photographs. Antonio and Isabel beaming on a white sand beach in the Maldives. She said yes. The caption read, her hand, sporting a garishly large diamond, splayed across his chest. Then came the wedding photos in a lavish Italian villa. Isabel in a sleek modern gown, gazing at him with a look of pure predatory triumph. She was no longer the secretary. She was the queen, seated firmly on the throne I had helped build. My sons, visiting for the weekend, were unusually quiet, their discomfort a palpable thing in my small apartment. A fresh wave of pain washed over me, so acute it was physical. I closed the app, my hands trembling. I walked to my window, looking out at the city we had once conquered together. The anger and hurt swirled inside me, a toxic brew. But then a strange calm settled over me. I looked toward the glittering skyline where his corporate headquarters stood, a monument to his ambition. "Enjoy the view from the top, Isabel," I whispered into the twilight, my voice steady and cold. "It's a long, long way down." I had spent 15 years as the silent partner, the strategic mind behind the charismatic face. I had negotiated contracts Antonio found tedious, restructured departments he didn't understand, and cultivated the client relationships he took for granted. That knowledge was mine. I rented a small, sunlit office with the money from my rings and my savings. I called it Veritas Consulting. Truth. My first clients were the ones Antonio had considered too small, the startups and family-owned businesses he'd brushed aside in his pursuit of bigger fish. I poured everything into them, my focus a laser. Word spread. The woman who helped build Cortez Enterprises was now offering her genius to others, and she was affordable. The phone began to ring. A local tech firm needed a new operational structure. A boutique hotel chain was floundering and needed a turnaround strategy. I worked 16-hour days, the exhaustion a welcome substitute for the grief. The success was slow, methodical, and entirely my own. There were no board members to appease, no husband to placate, no need to dim my light so his could shine brighter. I was building my own story, brick by brick, and with every satisfied client, the ghost of my old life grew fainter. I was becoming Marisla Cortez, the founder, the CEO, the force. But that's when karma stepped in, and the cracks in their paradise began to show. The whispers started in my professional circles, the same ones where Antonio had once been king. A former colleague from Cortez Enterprises reached out for lunch. Over salads, her voice dropped. "It's a mess over there, Marisla. Isabel. She's not just the wife." She leaned in. She demanded a seat on the board, said she understood the vision better than anyone. According to my source, Isabel had been quietly maneuvering, forging alliances with newer, more ambitious board members, questioning Antonio's older, more conservative strategies. She wasn't content being the trophy wife. She wanted to be the queen regent. She started signing off on mid-level deals without his final approval, citing efficiency. She'd replaced his longtime, loyal assistant with one of her own friends. The company Antonio had built with my help was being slowly, systematically infiltrated. The empire we had constructed was showing fissures, not from external pressure, but from a parasite within. The love he had destroyed our marriage for was revealing its true nature. It was not a partnership, but a takeover. The foundation was cracking, and he was too blinded by infatuation, or perhaps too arrogant to see it. The news broke like a thunderclap. It was the lead story on the business channel I kept on mute in my office. "CORTZ Enterprises faces boardroom coup." I turned up the volume, my heart hammering against my ribs. The details were stunning. Isabel, using her position and her new allies on the board, had attempted a hostile takeover. She had presented a damning report to the major investors, highlighting Antonio's reckless spending and emotional decision-making, conveniently omitting her own role in those decisions. She had secretly been funneling company capital into a series of shell corporations, preparing to jump ship with the liquidity. The board, in a panic, had turned on Antonio, holding him personally responsible for the massive financial breach and the internal chaos. They voted him out. But when the lawyers and auditors descended to find Isabel, she was gone. Vanished. She had transferred millions to untraceable offshore accounts, taken the physical copies of sensitive intellectual property, and left him holding the bag, a bankrupt company, a shattered reputation, and a mountain of legal trouble. The love he had chosen, the woman he had deemed more worthy than 15 years of partnership, had not just left him. She had systematically dismantled his life's work and set it on fire on her way out. The corporate betrayal was absolute, and it was a masterpiece of poetic justice. The news coverage was relentless, a 24-hour cycle of his disgrace. I tried to avoid it, focusing on my own work, but the story was inescapable. A part of me, the part that was still raw, felt a savage thrill, but a larger part felt a profound, weary sadness for the utter ruin of the dreams we had once shared. I heard through the grapevine, the same one that had brought me news of the cracks, about the final act. He had gone to the police, of course, filed a report. But Isabelle was a ghost, a phantom who had meticulously planned her exit. The money was gone, siphoned through a labyrinth of digital trails that led to nothing. The board was suing him for gross negligence. The investors had fled. He was left with nothing but liabilities. One evening, a contact sent me a grainy photo from a real estate blog. The for sale sign was hammered into the perfect lawn of the mansion on Willow Creek Drive. The caption was brutal. Former Cortez estate seeks new owner after financial collapse. I thought of him returning to that empty palace, the silence there far more profound and accusing than the one in my small apartment. The cars would be gone, repossessed. The bank accounts, frozen. The woman for whom he had traded everything, vanished into the ether. He was alone in the cavernous home that represented our shared past, surrounded by the expensive, hollow evidence of everything he had lost. The love he had destroyed me for had, in the end, destroyed him completely. The tabloids, which had once chronicled our power couple's status with fawning admiration, now feasted on his carcass with glee. The headlines were merciless. From CEO 2.0, the man who fell for his own scam. Secretary of Steel, how a tycoon lost his empire to his mistress. They dug up old photos of us, of him and Isabelle on that Maldivian beach, juxtaposing them with recent, grainy shots of him looking haggard and defeated, leaving a courthouse. The business magazines, once his champions, published long-form think pieces about the perils of poor governance, and when personal entanglements poison professional judgment, using him as the prime case study. His reputation, the thing he had prized above all else, was not just tarnished, it was pulverized. The phone that had once buzzed with endless invitations and deal-making opportunities was now silent. The friends who had flocked to him during his success had evaporated like morning dew. The city that had once knelt at his feet now looked upon him with a mixture of pity and scorn. For the first time since he was a hungry young entrepreneur with a big idea, Antonio Cortez was completely and utterly alone, trapped in the deafening echo of his own catastrophic choices. It was a Sunday evening. Rain streaked my apartment windows, turning the city lights into blurred watercolors. The knock was hesitant, almost timid, a sound that didn't belong in my new, orderly world. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door, and for a moment I didn't recognize the man standing there. It was Antonio, but it was a shrunken, faded photocopy of him. He had lost a significant amount of weight, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his frame. His face, usually tanned and confident, was pale and gaunt, etched with lines of stress and despair I had never seen before. His eyes, which had once held such fiery ambition, were now hollow pools of defeat. The rain had plastered his thinning hair to his forehead. He looked broken. "Marisla," he said, his voice a raspy whisper, stripped of all its former authority. He stood there, dripping on my welcome mat, a monument to his own ruin. I didn't speak. I just looked at him, this ghost from my past, and felt a tidal wave of conflicting emotions. "I made a mistake," he finally choked out, the words seeming to cost him everything. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips. It held no joy, only the cold clarity of vindication. "Yes," I replied, my voice calm and even in the rainy quiet. "You did." I let him in. He stood awkwardly in my living room, his eyes darting around, taking in the evidence of my quiet, successful independence. The shelves of business books, the framed $1 from Veritas Consulting, the vibrant art that was purely my taste. He didn't sit. "They're going to take everything, Marisla," he said, his voice gaining a desperate, pleading edge. "The lawsuits, the creditors, I'm going to lose the house, everything. I have nothing left." He finally looked at me, and the raw need in his eyes was unsettling. "You were always the smart one, the strategic one. You saw things I never could. Please, you have to help me. Help me fix this. Tell me what to do." The irony was so thick it was suffocating. The man who had dismissed my counsel, who had chosen a pretty smile over a sharp mind, was now begging for that same mind to save him from the consequences of that choice. He wasn't asking for me back. He was asking for my brain, for the very asset he had so carelessly discarded. He was looking at me not as his former wife, but as his last, best hope for a lifeline. I didn't answer him immediately. I let his plea hang in the air between us, watching him squirm in the devastating silence, a silence that was louder and more powerful than any rejection could ever be. After he left, slinking back into the rainy night with his tail between his legs, my apartment felt charged with the ghost of his desperation. I poured a glass of wine, my hand steady, and walked to the full-length mirror in my bedroom. I looked at the woman reflected there. Her hair was shorter, smarter. Her eyes, while tired from a long week of work, held a light of their own, a fire that came from within, not from the reflection of someone else's success. She stood straight, dressed in comfortable, expensive clothes she had bought with her own money. This was a woman who had been to hell and back, who had been left for dead in the wreckage of her old life, and who had clawed her way out alone. I looked deep into my own eyes and whispered the truth that had been crystallizing inside me since the moment I signed those divorce papers. "You don't owe anyone your strength anymore." The words landed with the force of a divine decree. The woman who had once cried for him, who had begged the universe for answers, was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her own worth, who had built her own fortress, and who would never again give anyone the key. The reflection stared back, unwavering. She was enough. She was more than enough. The Monday after Antonio's visit, I walked into my office with a renewed sense of purpose. His desperation was not my burden to carry, but it served as a potent reminder of my own resilience. I threw myself into my work with an intensity that surprised even me. Veritas Consulting was thriving, and now a new, ironic stream of clients began to appear. They were the former investors and board members of Cortez Enterprises, the very men who had once sat across from me at charity galas, nodding politely while their eyes glazed over when I offered a business insight. Now they sat in my client chairs, their expressions earnest, even deferential. "Marisla," one of them said, shaking his head, "we should have listened to you from the start. Your operational plans were always sounder than his grandstanding." They came to me with their new ventures, their damaged portfolios, seeking the strategic mind Antonio had foolishly cast aside. I took them on, not out of pity, but because they were good for business. My fees were high, my contracts ironclad. With every invoice I sent, with every successful strategy I implemented for them, I felt another piece of my power being restored. Karma was indeed poetic, and it was weaving a tapestry of justice with threads of my own making. I wasn't just rebuilding my life. I was building a legacy on the ashes of his. The annual Innovators and Leaders Summit was the city's most prestigious business event, one Antonio and I had dominated for a decade. This year, I walked in alone, my head held high, wearing a sharp crimson power suit that screamed confidence, not vulnerability. The buzz in the room shifted as I entered. I felt the weight of countless glances, the whispers that trailed in my wake. And then I saw him. Antonio was lurking near the back, a shadow of his former self trying to look inconspicuous. Our eyes met across the crowded room. A flashbulb went off, capturing the moment, the triumphant ex-wife in her prime, the disgraced former CEO in his ruin. A reporter, sensing blood in the water, approached me. "Ms. Cortez, any comment on the collapse of Cortez Enterprises?" I offered a serene, professional smile. "My focus is solely on the future of Veritas Consulting and my clients." I didn't look at Antonio again, but I could feel his gaze burning into me. He pretended not to know me, turning his back to engage in a conversation with a potted plant, but his body language, the slumped shoulders, the nervous tug at his collar, betrayed everything. The cameras had captured the real story, his fall and my unassailable rise. Weeks later, an email landed in my inbox from a law firm I recognized, the one handling Antonio's asset liquidation. The subject line was stark. "Sale of property, 101 Willow Creek Drive." A bitter laugh escaped me. The ultimate symbol of our shared life, The mansion I had lovingly decorated and he had so callously filled with another woman was now a liability he was desperate to unload. His lawyer, a man who had once drafted our prenuptial agreements, called me personally. "Marisla," he said, his voice strained with professional embarrassment. "He's motivated. The bank is foreclosing. We're hopping for a quick, quiet sale." I let the silence stretch, savoring the poetic justice. "What's the asking price?" I asked, my voice cool. He named a figure, a fraction of its worth. "I'll have my lawyer draw up the papers," I said. "I'll pay in cash." The silence on the other end was profound. I had just bought my own past, not out of sentimentality, but as the ultimate declaration of my victory. The day I received the keys, I drove back to Willow Creek Drive. The for sale sign was gone. The lawn was slightly overgrown. Using my new key, I pushed open the heavy oak door. The grand foyer echoed with my solitary footsteps. The house was empty, stripped of all the furniture and art we had collected together. Sunlight streamed through the massive windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I walked through the cavernous rooms, my heels clicking on the bare marble. I could still hear the ghosts, the laughter, the arguments, the silence that had grown between us, but they had no power over me anymore. I stood in the center of the vast living room, the heart of the home that had once been my cage, and a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. "This time," I whispered, my voice clear and strong in the emptiness, "the house belongs to the woman who built it. Not just the physical structure, but the dream it represented." I had not just bought a property. I had reclaimed a piece of my soul. Little did he know, the woman he discarded was about to own everything he lost. The final, spectacular act of Isabel's betrayal played out on national news. She hadn't just disappeared. She had been tracked down by Interpol in a luxury villa in Montenegro. The charges were read like a thriller novel: international wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, money laundering, embezzlement on a grand scale. It turned out Isabel was a pseudonym. Her real name was Ivana Petrovic, a known con artist with a history of targeting wealthy, powerful men. The news channels played security footage of her being led away in handcuffs, her face a mask of cold defiance. The fairy-tale romance that had destroyed my marriage was now exposed as a meticulously planned, criminal enterprise. Antonio wasn't just a cuckolded husband. He was the most famous victim of an international scam artist. The scandal was complete, his humiliation absolute. The man who had traded a loyal partner for a fantasy was now the punchline of a global joke, his name forever linked with one of the most brazen corporate heists in recent memory. The empire was not just fallen, it was a crime scene, and he was its most prominent and foolish exhibit. Chapter 21, The Visit. The news of Isabel's arrest, or Ivana's, rather, had been the city's leading story for a week. I had deliberately unplugged, focusing on plans for the Willow Creek property, which I'd decided to convert into a high-end corporate retreat center. The doorbell's chime was an unwelcome interruption. Through the peephole, I saw him again, Antonio. But this time, the desperation had deepened into something hollowed out and feral. The gauntness was more pronounced, his eyes sunken into dark, bruised sockets. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks, haunted not just by financial ruin, but by the profound, soul-crushing humiliation of being a global laughingstock. I opened the door not out of pity, but with a clinical curiosity. He didn't wait for an invitation. "Marisla," he breathed, the word a ragged plea. You know what she is, what she did." He was trembling, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "The lawyers say I might still be liable, that I should have known, that I was negligent. They're talking about criminal negligence." His voice cracked. "I have nothing left, nothing. My name is Mud. My face is on tabloids next to hers. No one will return my calls. I have nowhere to go." He took a stumbling step forward, his eyes wild. "Please, you're the only one who ever truly knew how it all worked. You're the only one who understands the business, the records. You could look at the files, you could testify, you could tell them I was just blind. Stupid, not a criminal. Please, Marisla, help me." He was begging now, utterly broken, a shipwrecked man seeing a distant sail. He was asking me to be his character witness, to vouch for his incompetence to save him from prison. The irony was so perfectly, devastatingly complete. I looked at him, this man who had once held my entire world in his hands, and I felt a profound, oceanic calm. There was no hatred, no schadenfreude. There was only the quiet, absolute knowledge of my own liberation. I didn't offer him a seat. I didn't offer him water. I simply looked into his desperate, broken eyes and replied, my voice soft yet carrying the weight of finality. I already did, Antonio. I helped you by letting you go. I saw the confusion, then the dawning, horrific understanding in his face. My help had not been in saving him from his consequences. My help had been in getting out of his way, in allowing him to walk headlong into the destiny he had so fervently chosen. By removing my intelligence, my caution, my love from his life, I had given him the freedom to fall. And that was the only help a man like him could truly understand. I gently closed the door, leaving him standing on the other side, finally and fully comprehending the true cost of the mistake he had made. The click of the latch was the most peaceful sound I had ever heard. It wasn't the sound of a door shutting him out. It was the sound of a chapter closing, the cover of a heavy book being sealed forever. I didn't lean against the door, listening for his retreating footsteps. I didn't feel a surge of victory or a pang of guilt. I simply walked back to my desk, to the architectural plans for the retreat center, and picked up my pencil. The line I drew was steady, my focus absolute. There was no grand, public announcement of my win. I didn't give interviews about my ex-husband's downfall. I didn't post a triumphant message on social media. I understood now that real closure isn't something you get from the person who wronged you. It's something you build for yourself, brick by quiet brick, in the fortress of your own spirit. His suffering added nothing to my peace. It was merely a confirmation of a path I had already walked away from. Gloating would have been a regression, a way of still letting his narrative dictate my emotions. True power, I had learned, lies in silence, in the quiet confidence of a life well lived beyond the drama. Real karma doesn't scream its victories from the rooftops. It whispers a profound, unshakable peace into the soul of the one who was wronged, a peace so deep that the noise of the past simply fades into irrelevance. My closure was in the business I built, in the home I created, in the woman I had become. He was no longer part of that equation. That night, I lit a single candle and opened my journal. The blank page was no longer intimidating. It was a friend. My pen moved with a certainty that came from hard-won wisdom. He didn't break me, I wrote, the ink flowing smoothly. He released me. Sometimes, the people who cause the most destruction in your life are unwittingly the catalysts for your greatest transformation. They push you off a cliff you were too afraid to jump from yourself, forcing you to grow wings on the way down. I thought of the terrified woman I had been, the one who signed the divorce papers in a state of shock. I thought of the determined woman who cut her hair and sold her rings. I thought of the formidable woman who now owned the mansion that was once her gilded cage. They push you into your destiny, I continued, the truth of it resonating in my bones. Not the destiny you planned, but the one you were always meant for, a destiny built on your own terms, with your own two hands, fueled by your own unshakable spirit. I meant every word. Antonio's betrayal was no longer a wound. It was a scar, a reminder of a battle I had survived and that had, ultimately, made me stronger. The pain had been the fire that tempered my steel. Without it, I might have remained Marisla, the wife, forever. Now I was simply Marisla, and that was more than enough. Years have a way of smoothing even the sharpest edges of the past. Veritas Consulting didn't just flourish, it became a benchmark. I was no longer Antonio Cortez's ex-wife. In business circles, I was Marisla Cortez of Veritas, spoken with a tone of respect. Women, young and old, sought my mentorship, not just on business strategy, but on rebuilding after personal catastrophe. They saw in me a blueprint for survival that was not about bitterness, but about boundless growth. Men who had once overlooked me now listened intently in boardrooms. Their respect earned not through my association with a powerful man, but through the power of my own intellect and resolve. The Willow Creek Mansion, now the Veritas Retreat, became a sought-after sanctuary for executives seeking clarity. I often walked its halls, no longer hearing ghosts, but hearing the quiet hum of focused minds, the murmur of deals being struck, the sound of my own vision brought to life. I had become everything he and his arrogance had implied I couldn't be without him. A leader, an innovator, a success in my own right. My redemption wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about proving myself right. It was living, breathing proof that a person could not only survive being broken apart, but could reassemble themselves into something infinitely more beautiful, powerful, and complete. The pinnacle arrived when I was honored with the Lifetime Achievement in Ethical Leadership Award. The auditorium was packed with the city's elite, the same audience that had witnessed my fall from grace years before. As I walked onto the stage, the spotlight warm on my face, I didn't feel nervous. I felt a deep, abiding sense of belonging. My speech was about resilience, about integrity, about building a legacy that outlasts scandal. And then, as I looked out into the sea of faces, my gaze inadvertently found his. Antonio was seated near the back in a simple suit, a guest of someone else. He wasn't the broken man from my doorstep, nor the arrogant king of old. He just looked ordinary, deflated. Our eyes met. There was no anger there, no plea, just a profound, bottomless regret that seemed to have settled into the very lines of his face. And then, slowly, he began to clap. Not a loud, dramatic applause, but a steady, sincere rhythm, his eyes never leaving mine. It was an acknowledgement, a silent admission that the woman he had left behind had soared to heights he could now only look up at from the valley of his own making. In that moment, the circle was complete. The story that began with his betrayal ended not with my revenge, but with my transcendent peace. And that's when the twist hit. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace, and I finally had it. They say betrayal breaks you, but sometimes it rebuilds you. He traded loyalty for lust and lost everything money couldn't buy. I traded pain for purpose and gained everything he never valued. Karma doesn't always punish loudly. Sometimes it rewards quietly. The Karma Diaries.